We might not always think about it this way, but we live in a rational universe. Maybe there's a better way I can say it. We live in a universe where things happen for a reason. Because things happen for a reason, we can know and even make predictions based on what we've seen. And you already know this. You know that the sun will continue to rise in the east and set in the west. You know that fire produces extreme heat and that it will burn you if it touches you. You know that the law of gravity means what goes up must come down. What's interesting about all this is the fact that when we say things happen for a reason, we seem to assume that reason went into those things in the first place. Reason is a word we've given to things that make sense, things that have sense, and things that happen for a reason. And generally speaking, when you see sense behind something, when you see that purpose and intention went into its making, you assume that there's a person behind it. What about these gondolas? They're carefully constructed for our convenience, and they follow a set of careful rules to make getting up this mountain easier. Obviously, you don't think that their bearings, their wheels, and cables just came together accidentally. No. People had to put these pieces together in a very precise way and follow a very specific set of mathematical rules in order for this machinery to work. Our world and our universe are the same way. They work so precisely and so carefully to keep us alive. And the processes we see follow an order and an arrangement. And this is no accident. Someone had to do the ordering and the arranging in the first place. Well, Dr. Lennox, I'd like to ask you this time about the word logic or reason and rationality. We hear those words a lot, particularly if you're in an argument with someone and you want them to think logically, or you say be reasonable. How do you think most people mean those words when they use them like that?
Well, I suppose what they're looking for is a valid argument, and they can follow each step of it from its assumptions to its conclusion. And of course, as a mathematician, that is my stock in trade. Very tight logic, but I don't think we're talking here about mathematical logic, which is a complex subject. We're talking about ordinary arguments that are used to present a case. Very often people fall into fallacies where the logic is not tight, and yet it seems very convincing. For instance, when I debated Peter Singer, he said that one of his biggest objections to the Christian faith was that people tended to remain in the religion in which they were brought up. This was his big objection to religion. Now, that sounds very plausible, but when you investigate it, and I admitted to him, my parents were Christians, I'm a Christian, but then I said to him, you're an atheist. Yes, and what about your parents? Well, it turns out they're atheists too. So I said, you have stayed in the faith in which you're brought up. And he said, but it isn't a faith. And then I said, but you do believe it, don't you? So of course it's a faith. In other words, neither of those statements says anything about the truth of what we believe. And the question is not, did you stay in the religion in which you're brought up, but is what you believe true? So that shows us that logical analysis of argument is extremely important. And I would like to say also that as a Christian, my faith is based on evidence. It's not blind faith, because faith is not believing where there's no evidence. That's blind faith. The Christian faith is based firmly on evidence. Centrally, the evidence of the resurrection objectively, and of course the evidence of one's own experience subjectively.
Now, as a mathematician, you of course draw logical conclusions on many things with regards to the universe. But any of us, to at least an extent, can logically understand the universe. And does that strike you as a remarkable thing?
Oh, it does indeed. But it had to be drawn to my attention by none less than Albert Einstein, who once said, the only incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it's comprehensible. Einstein was a very clever man, and he saw that there was something here. How is it that our mind in here can understand, at least in part, the universe out there? Eugene Wigner, another Nobel Prize winner of physics, he talked about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. How is it reasonable and logical that mathematics thought up in here can actually represent something out there? Well, I react to that this way. I say, well, it is unreasonable if you're an atheist. What I mean by that is this. We do science with our minds. So what is the mind? Well, my atheist friends tell me the mind is the brain. There's no mind stuff separate from brain stuff. The mind is the brain. What's the brain? The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Well, why should I trust it then? As J.B.S. Haldane, a chemist, said years ago, if the thoughts in my mind are simply the random motions of atoms in my brain, why should I believe anything my brain tells me, including the fact it's composed of atoms? And C.S. Lewis commented rightly on this. He said it's like a man sitting on a tree sawing off the branch on which he sits. Now you see, this is my biggest objection to atheism. Not that it denies God, of course it does by definition, but that it denies a base, a rational base for the rationality that we use to do science. It takes a leap of blind faith, trusting what it tells me is a mindless, unguided process to produce scientific results. That's real blind faith, isn't it? Whereas Christian theism tells me that the reason I can, with my mind in here, understand, at least in part, the universe out there is that both the mind and the universe are ultimately traceable to the same intelligent creator. And of course, that was the belief that cradled modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries. As Lewis put it, men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And why did they expect law in nature? Because they believed in a lawgiver. So it seems to me that the rationality and the logic is very much on the side of theism.
Now, a lot of people like to throw out the question, can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it, or can he make a square circle? And it's easy to laugh and dismiss the question. Admittedly, sometimes I have, but buried in that is a real question. Is God bound by the rationality of his creation?
Well, let's start by laughing at them. Well, when you ask this question, I always think of what C.S. Lewis said about that question. He said it just shows that nonsense remains nonsense, even if we talk it about God. But I take your point. There is a serious aspect to this question. We study the universe and we find regularities and laws. And then people say, well, look, if the universe is like that, you can't believe that God breaks those laws and that there are miracles like the ones we find in the New Testament, Jesus turning water into wine, Jesus rising from the dead. You can't possibly retain any scientific integrity and believe in those things because those miracles violate the laws of nature. We know they're absolute. You see, people could believe that kind of thing 20 centuries ago when they didn't know the laws of nature, but it's impossible for us. Let's unpack that a little bit. Firstly, I want to say that they weren't so ignorant 20 centuries ago. They knew exactly that dead bodies don't rise from the dead. That is why they preached the resurrection of Jesus as a miracle. But now let's look at this question. Do miracles violate the laws of nature? Well, what are the laws of nature? They are our descriptions of what normally happens. So let's take a simple law. We'll do it with arithmetic. 1 and 1 makes 2, okay? So I put $100 plus $100 into my drawer tonight. I wake up tomorrow morning and I find $50. What do I say? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken or the laws of the United States? I think I'd say the laws of the United States have been broken. Now that simple illustration points up a fact that law in the scientific sense is not the same as law in the legal sense of the laws of a country. Now, what is it that tells me that the laws of the United States have been broken and that the thief has stolen some of my dollars? It's because I know the law of arithmetic. If I didn't know that 1 and 1 make 2, I'd say, oh well, 1 and 1's 2 today, it's not tomorrow. So what, you know? It's because I know the regularity that I can recognize that someone has put their hand in. Now you see, the laws can't prevent the thief doing that, can they? And it's exactly the same. God has created a universe which we have described and encoded in laws. But God is not a prisoner of those laws. He can feed a new event in. And that's exactly what Christians claim. Let's take the major miracle of the resurrection. They don't claim it happened by natural processes going on in the tomb of Jesus 5 minutes before he rose. They claim it was an injection from outside of his energy and power. He raised Jesus from the dead. Now science, what can science say? Science can tell us that resurrections are very improbable. We could do an experiment. We could send 1 million people out to graves and have them watch a grave for a month, sit out all night in a tent with a notebook, and they all come back with zeros, Okay, they didn't see a resurrection. So what could we deduce scientifically? We could deduce on the basis of observation that miracles, resurrections are improbable. We couldn't say they're impossible. In order to say they were impossible, we'd have to have checked every grave since the dawn of history. And there was a grave, wasn't there? Where we read a historical narrative that it was observed and was watched, and something very special happened, and that forms the central historical resurrection evidence. So you see, science can say improbable, but not impossible. Science cannot exclude a resurrection, because a resurrection doesn't break the laws of nature.
Well, thanks very much, Dr. Lennox. That was awesome.
That's a pleasure.